The president is not afraid of anything. The president is traveling to Dar es Salaam confidently and knowing very well that he will come back safe and sound, and the country will be safe and sound.
But the president should have been more concerned. Now, after weeks of protests against Pierre Nkurunziza's bid for another presidential term, military officials took advantage of his absence this week and attempted a military takeover. Now, President Nkurunziza is back in the country attempting to pick up the pieces, but the underlying problems still remain the same. So what will it take to solve Burundi's presidential problems? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, in order to fully understand what is happening in Burundi, we have to go back some 15 years. Signed in 2000, the Arusha Agreement paved the way for Burundi's first democratic elections and marked the beginning of the country's post-conflict reconstruction. Nominated by the CNDD-FDD, Nkurunziza went on to win a vote by members of parliament and became Burundi's president on August the 19th, 2005. Now established by the United Nations Security Council in May of 2004 to oversee implementation of the Arusha Agreement, the United Nations wound up its mission in Burundi on the 1st of January 2007, transferring many of the functions to the UN Integrated Office in Burundi. Then, in 2008, the Burundi government and FNL rebels signed a ceasefire, paving the way for FNL leader Agathon Rwasa to return home from exile in Tanzania. 2 years later, Nkurunziza was elected in a poll boycotted by Burundi's main opposition parties at both the presidential and parliamentary level. And this brings us to last year, when Nkurunziza started hinting that he might seek a third 5-year term in office, despite opposition complaints that this would be unconstitutional. Earlier this month, Burundi's constitutional court ruled in favor of Nkurunziza's decision to run for a third term, setting off widespread protests and forcing thousands who are fearing for their lives to flee to neighboring Rwanda, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then matters came to a head on the 13th of May 2015, when in a dramatic twist of events, General Godefroy Niyombare announced he had deposed President Pierre Nkurunziza. But the story again changed. Loyalists announced Friday that the uprising had been crushed. The government claimed to be back in control of key locations in the country, with several arrests being made. Now, after much speculation over the whereabouts of the man himself, Pierre Nkurunziza finally revealed he was back in the country. Using social media on Thursday evening, he announced his return. CCTV's Kofom Ranger is in Burundi. He filed this report.
The convoy of Pierre Nkurunziza makes its way into the capital. At this stage, the president was not showing himself to the crowds. But here at least, his support is not in doubt.
We are very happy to see our president. We elected him and we want him back. We heard he was hiding, that he had been overthrown. But we're happy that he's coming back to his country and to the people who elected him.
But plenty has happened in those 2 days. This city became a battleground for troops who supported the coup and those ordered to crush it. For much of Thursday, both sides claimed to be in control, and the president was stuck in Tanzania. But late Thursday, Nkurunziza told his supporters he was back, and by Friday morning, the coup ringleaders were arrested.
We are looking for the rest. The information we are getting is that they are still hiding in the country, but we urge them not to wait until we find them. They should just surrender and apologize to the government and the people of Burundi.
News of the capture of coup leader Godefroy Niyombare emerged just before Nkurunziza's convoy swept into town. Not everyone is pleased Nkurunziza is back. There had been demonstrations against him for almost 3 weeks before Wednesday's coup attempt. Some have vowed to resume those protests.
Our stand remains the same. We're against him running for another term. And we are planning to go back to the streets maybe tomorrow or Monday. He must drop his plan.
We hope he has changed his mind. We want him to go and pick his nomination papers from the Electoral Commission and allow other people to run. If not, we're going back to the streets.
But demonstrators against Nkurunziza say they've been warned. They'll be treated not as protesters now, but as rebels. Kofam Ranger, CCTV, Bujumbura, Burundi.
Well, before we get into our discussion, let's first cross to CCTV's Kofam Ranger. He's standing by for us in Bujumbura. Kofa, we just saw huge crowds, though, welcoming President Nkurunziza back into Bujumbura. What is the mood in Burundi at the moment? What are the people saying now that it looks like that military coup attempt has been crushed?
Well, Beatrice, the tide has turned drastically here in Burundi's capital, Bujumbura. Just 2 days ago, hundreds of supporters of the leaders of the coup taken to the streets to celebrate after an announcement was made that President Pierre Nkurunziza had been deposed. The situation was totally different yesterday. A sense of a calm inside the city. All the streets deserted. Shops had been closed. A sense of anxiety. People not knowing exactly what is going on and who was in charge of the affairs of the country. Of course, announcements were being made from both sides. The government was insisting that it was still in control of the affairs of the country. The coup supporters and leaders were also making statements here, making statements saying they were in charge of the affairs of the country. However, today, things are totally different. Hundreds of supporters of the president have poured into the streets of Bujumbura here wearing white t-shirts, ready to welcome the president back to the city. He has, of course, arrived here. We had gotten information last night that the president was back into the country, but it was not clear exactly where he was. However, we understood that he was spotted in his hometown of Ngozi, greeting supporters and thanking them for the support that they've assured him. It is the same situation here. Hundreds of them are saying that they would want him to stay, they want him to continue, and they will vote for him if he stands again for another term. However, we also understand that civil society organizations are calling on their supporters to go back to the streets and continue with their protests to try and push President Pierre Nkurunziza to drop his bid to run for another term in office.
All right, Kofam Ranger for us there in Bujumbura with that development. Thank you. Well, joining me now in Nairobi is Dr. Yolande Buka. She's a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies here in Africa. Thank you for joining us here on the program. And standing by for us in Oxford in the UK is Jean-Benoit Felice. He's a political researcher at Oxford University's International Development Department. And in Washington, D.C., Kelsey Liley. She's an assistant director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. To you all, thank you very much for joining us here on the program. Yolande, to you first, though. Burundi very much is still transitioning from political violence, though, to a democratic institution. What is your reading, though, of the developments at this point?
Well, I think what we're going to see in Burundi, what we actually see in Burundi at the moment is several steps back from where the country had been able to achieve in the past decade. There's been definitely a breach of trust from President Nkurunziza to decide to run for a third mandate. People who are in Burundi often refer to the Arusha Agreement as a law that cannot be violated. And unfortunately, as things have developed, there's a sense that there's a disconnect between the ruling party and the opposition in terms of where the Arusha Agreement stands at the moment.
But we haven't really known much of what is going on inside Burundi. We just saw, though, that President Nkurunziza was received by huge crowds when he returned to Bujumbura. So really, where does that leave this whole situation?
Well, it's very interesting to see so many, supporters of President Nkurunziza in Bujumbura at the moment. It makes you want to ask, where were those supporters in the past 10 to 15 days when opposition members demonstrators and protesters were protesting in the cities against his mandate. What I think it's showing is the ruling party's decision to possibly, and we'll see when the president addresses the nation, to possibly forge ahead with his nomination and show that he has popular support for such a move.
Jean-Benoit?
I would agree that it's going to be a very unstable period. It's likely to be violent. It's likely that we will see a repression of the protesters, of the opposition. Yeah, it's all very unclear, but we'll have to see how Nkurunziza addresses the nation and what he's going to do now, because now he's actually the master of the game. It's really up to him to calm down the situation, perhaps engage with the opposition, or to go ahead alone in his bid for a third term.
All right. Kelsey, though, in Washington, D.C., what's your take, though, on this whole situation? How have you been viewing the developments in Burundi?
Well, I certainly think what's about to happen when the president addresses the nation is somewhat of an inflection point. If he's able to calm tensions and call for dialogue and truly engage the opposition, that may be a good period for Burundi. But I fear that in the coming hours, in the coming days, if he's not able to do that, we may see revenge killings, we may see more violence. We're certainly going to see opposition members who are already in the streets. And so that's certainly very concerning, especially from Washington, looking at the regional dynamics. We've seen 105,000 refugees fleeing Burundi. And so that's something that we're watching very closely.
Before we get to the regional dynamics, though, Yolanda, what was this all about? Was this simply about the president wanting an extension of his mandate?
Well, you know, I think briefly, one needs to look at the president's term since he began his presidency in 2010. In fact, in 2005. I don't think it's anything new, and what will likely happen if the president does not extend a hand of negotiation is further repression, which is falls well within what he's been doing for the past decade.
But in terms, though, of the protests itself, though, I mean, there was a whole talk of a breach of the Constitution, a breach of the Arusha Accord. What are the underlying issues that have brought Burundi to this point?
What you see, obviously, in addition to the closing of the political space, which is often forgotten from this discussion, is a dispute over how do you read Arusha. And this dispute is quite new, in fact, because when people signed the Constitution and signed Arusha, I don't think there was any ambiguity about what 2015 was meant to mean for President Nkurunziza. But at this point, in the past year or so, the ruling party has argued that the Article 302 of the Constitution, which states that the first post-rendition president is to be elected indirectly by Parliament, falls outside the limits instituted in Article 96, which say that a president will be elected by universal suffrage and can only be renewed once. So I think it's this dispute, and according to the ruling party, this loophole allows Nkurunziza to run for an additional mandate. Most of the international community and the opposition believe that the Constitution should be read within the framework of the Arusha Agreement, and Article 7 of the Arusha Agreement clearly states that no president can be at this position for more than 2 terms.
Jean-Benoit, I see you shaking your head. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, again, I think that the issue on the Constitution is definitely important, but I think we also need to look at the economy. I mean, I'm not a legal expert. It seems a lot of legal experts have taken positions regarding the Constitution and its interpretation. They seem to be mostly disagreeing with the Constitutional Court of Burundi. They seem to say that actually there is no question a third term is possible, even if the president was elected by the parliament first time. But I think we also need to look at the economy. We also need to look at the state of the country. And the reason we are seeing this massive unrest in Bujumbura, at least, also because people don't see any gain, don't see any benefit of the Nkurunziza regime for the past 10 years. So I think it's a bit. I think it's definitely important to look at the Constitution, but it's not the only part of the story. And the national media hasn't really focused on the state of the country, which has pushed people in the streets. The fact that you still have 58% of the population that's malnourished, the fact that you have massive corruption, these are really issues that are touching Burundians in their daily lives, and especially those who live in Bujumbura, who migrated to Bujumbura, who would be a sort of a middle class and have a bit more voice than people living in the hills and being just farmers.
All right, Jean-Benoit, Yolande Buka and Kelsey Liley there. We'll take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll take a look at some of the East African communities' responses to the situation in Burundi. To stay with us.
Summit condemns in the strongest terms possible the coup in Burundi, and the summit is of the view that it does not solve the problems of Burundi. We don't accept the coup, we condemn it in the strongest terms possible, and we call upon return to constitutional order in that country. On looking at the situation in Burundi, we all agreed that the conditions at the moment are not conducive for elections to be held as scheduled.
Well, that was the East African Community Chair and President of Tanzania, Jakaya Kikwete, condemning the attempted coup in Burundi at the EAC summit in Dar es Salaam earlier this week. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now with me in Nairobi, I still have Dr. Yolande Buka. She's a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies here in Nairobi. Standing by in Oxford, Jean-Benoit Felice. He's a political researcher at Oxford University's International Development Department. And still in Washington, D.C., Kelsey Liley, Assistant Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for staying with us on the program. Kelsey, start off with you, though. You did mention earlier about the humanitarian crisis that has been occasioned by the Burundi situation. But there is a wider fear, though, by the region if Burundi goes to pieces. What's your take on that?
Sure, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I think sort of looking at history, the international community has good reason to be concerned about instability in the Great Lakes region. If Burundi goes to pieces, that will certainly mean more refugees fleeing into neighboring countries. So Rwanda, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of the Congo, those countries are very quickly going to run out of space, of resources, and of kind of political will to deal with that many people. And so that's very concerning. The other, if we also are seeing armed elements of the population fleeing, we could potentially see arms crossing borders, militancy crossing borders. That's certainly a concern for the region as well.
Are we seeing any activity, though, to that effect coming out at this point?
I think the biggest concern at the moment is the ruling party's youth militia, so the Imbonerakure. And so about a year ago, there was a UN memo that was leaked in Bujumbura that said that elements of this youth militia were training in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and that they were actually being armed and trained by elements of Pierre Nkurunziza's party. So if that's true, if that's still what's happening today, that's certainly an issue, and that would potentially have security consequences for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Rwanda is also watching very, very closely. They don't want any kind of armed elements coming in and out of their borders.
All right. Yolanda, this has been discussed in various international fora, though. The UN Security Council has discussed Burundi. The African Union has talked about Burundi. The EAC heads of state held a summit on this. And the African Union Peace and Security Council, though, did announce that the crisis can be resolved through peaceful and legal means and in line with the Arusha Agreement. At this point, though, is that possible?
Well, it'll depend the level of leverage they feel they have in Burundi. Nkurunziza has a lot of power at the moment. He is symbolically in the country. He's come back from being outside of the country and being surprised by a military coup to the vanquisher of this particular situation. So it will be determined by his willingness to move away from his maximalist position. The African Union seems very serious. If you read today's Peace and Security Council decision, they are determined as the guarantor of the Arusha Accord to get it implemented, which means that they're implicitly taking the position that Nkurunziza should not run for an additional mandate. They're also calling on the UN Security Council to help them ensure that all stakeholders allow for peaceful resolution of the political crisis. And as mentioned, the East African community members are concerned about the situation. The last thing Rwanda or the DRC, which is not a part of the EAC, but very closely related to the situation, and Tanzania want to see is more than the number of refugees that they already have. International organizations have had contingency plans in those countries to receive the refugees, but they were not expecting such large numbers of them. And at one point or another, this will increase instability in those very limited regions. Food prices will increase. The refugees are going to exert pressure on those regions. And that's a very dangerous combination for the Great Lakes region.
Well, aside though from the international community response, let's see what the Burundi people have been saying about this whole situation. We'll come back to this discussion in just a moment. But first, let's take a look at some of the sentiments of the ordinary Burundian citizens in Bujumbura.
They say Burundians don't want him. Are these people not from Burundi? We will elect him, he will lead us, and if possible, we will change the constitution so that we can elect him again and again.
The military has done us proud. We are proud of ourselves too. We would have continued with the protests, even if they killed all of us. All we wanted is peace in the country.
We prayed so much, but now our prayers have been answered. We got what we wanted. All we want now is peace. That's why we are celebrating today. We are very happy.
We want peace. We want the respect of our nation and our legal texts. Our constitution is sacred. So are the Arusha Peace Accords. They brought us peace after 10 years of war in which we lost our sons and daughters. We don't want that anymore.
This is our country. We are not going anywhere. So we'll be still here. We're still fighting for the constitution, for Arusha Accords. So this is our way of showing it, that we are supporting the constitution and the Arusha Accord.
All right, the sentiments of Burundians there on the streets of Bujumbura. Jean Benoit, though, we're watching the army on the streets, we're watching the protests, and, you know, we're watching the supporters of President Nkurunziza. At this point, though, what can be done to avoid a regression of that peace accord? What next for Burundi?
That's a very hard question. What's next for Burundi? I guess what we'll have to see in the next few days is how much Nkurunziza, how much support he is getting from the countryside. It's a part of the story we're not told because we don't know much about the countryside. I was reading this morning that Nkurunziza was maybe planning to go first in Ngozi before Bujumbura. It seems he eventually went first to Bujumbura, but it sort of shows that he knows his main constituency is in the countryside. And that's very much the card he's been playing since the beginning, saying, well, maybe people are unhappy with me in Bujumbura, but it's actually only 5% of the population. 95% of the population is happy with me. Proof is they don't really trouble. They're very quiet. They're not the one unresting. So what's next for Burundi is a very challenging time. As I mentioned at the beginning, it will really depend on how Nkurunziza is handling the next few hours, what kind of opening he is giving to the opposition. And he's in a very strong position, so he knows he doesn't necessarily have to do that to keep power. He may just go alone. But if he goes that way, then we'll see. We're very likely to see more violence. We're very likely to see the continuation of the past 10 years, but sort of magnified, sort of endemic violence that was very much there in the hills and also in Bujumbura. We're very likely to see it magnified because people, as we saw in the piece, were very much against the president, at least in Bujumbura.
Well, John Benoit does raise an important point there. We have seen a lot of protests in the capital, Bujumbura. But what do we know about the populations in the countryside, which is a majority of Burundi?
Yeah, I think it depends on the region. Some regions are still very supportive of President Nkurunziza as the individual. And I think that's where the difference needs to be made between the individual and the party. One of the concerns of the CNDD-FDD, at least from observers, is that they are afraid that should Nkurunziza not be the face of the party for the presidential elections, they may not win as many seats in parliament, for instance, as they were expecting. So he's popular in the countryside, but there are also different parts of the country where Agathon Rwasa, the former leader of the FNL, is very popular. So, and then I think I wanted to point out this fact. It's Afrobarometer recently conducted a survey on people's perceptions of the third mandate issue. And according to that survey, 60% of the people who were interrogated were against that third mandate. So as an individual, Nkurunziza may be popular. It does not necessarily mean that people want to see him break the Constitution or the Arusha Agreement.
All right. Kelty Kylie in Washington, you have the final word on this. And your view on what next for Burundi?
Sure. Well, I think kind of an important point has just been brought up, which is that support for and against Nkurunziza and for the ruling party is very nuanced. You know, even in the capital, he has supporters, he has opposition. The countryside is similar, and so it's difficult to kind of paint one stroke throughout the country. And so I sort of think, you know, depending on what he does, protests may continue. If he chooses to co-opt some of the opposition, that may be a good sign. I don't see him doing that. He's certainly in a position of power, as Jean-Benoit mentioned. I worry that he may use this position of power to postpone elections, perhaps indefinitely. And so that's a place where the international community can really exert pressure and can push him not to use the position of power to further overrun the opposition and political rights in the country.
All right. Yolan Buka, we'll leave it there for the moment. Researcher, Institute for Security Studies. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Kelsey Liley, Assistant Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council, and John Benoit Felice joining us from Oxford. He's a political researcher at the Oxford University's International Development Department. To you all, thank you very much for joining us on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.